The colour drained from Henry VIII's face. His attendant had barely finished speaking when the king turned away. No tears, no words, just stillness. The kind of stillness that falls over a man when something inside him breaks so completely that the outside stops working. His son was dead, 17 years old, red-haired, broad-shouldered, charming, every inch a Tudor. Weeks ago he had been standing in Parliament in his best velvet. Now he was gone, in a sick room that smelled of fever and tallow candles, and the particular sweetness of a body that has run out of time. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Lord High Admiral of England, Knight of the Garter, bastard. That last word is the one that had followed him his entire life, and it's the one that in the end determined how his father would bury him. In secret, in straw, in silence, as if the whole embarrassing business of his existence could simply be carted out of London and forgotten. It couldn't. This is his story. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Rotten Ages. This channel is exactly what it sounds like. We dig into the parts of history that the textbooks skim over. Hit subscribe if that's your thing, and if you've been here before, thank you, genuinely. Now let's get into it. To grasp Henry Fitzroy's death, you need to understand the catastrophe that was Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. By 1518, Henry and Catherine had been married for 9 years. 9 years of trying, 9 years of pregnancies, hopes, nurseries being prepared, names being chosen, and then loss. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who breathed for a few weeks and then stopped. The only child who survived was a girl, Mary, and while Henry loved Mary, a girl could not, in his mind, in the mind of his court, in the paranoid logic of 16th century monarchy, secure the Tudor dynasty. Catherine had been through 6 pregnancies by this point, with 3 stillbirths among them. In November 1518, she was approaching yet another confinement, and Henry, being Henry, had found other entertainment. Her name was Elizabeth Blount. She went by Bessie. Bessie Blount was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, which tells you everything about the particular cruelty of Tudor court life. She was young, probably around 17 or 18. She was described as beautiful, accomplished. She was exactly the kind of woman Henry liked. When it became clear that Bessie was pregnant, Cardinal Wolsey, the king's fixer, the man who handled everything Henry didn't want to handle himself, stepped in. He arranged for her to go and stay in the prior's house at the Priory of St. Lawrence in Blackmore, where she gave birth to a healthy son, away from gossip as much as possible. The policy of discretion worked. Diplomatic dispatches record nothing of Henry VIII's illegitimate son, but Henry knew, and he was delighted. Henry VIII openly acknowledged the boy, perhaps because he felt that his lack of a male heir was a slur upon his manhood. At one point he proudly exhibited his newborn son to the court. The boy was given the surname Fitzroy, in Norman French, Fils de Roi, son of the king. It wasn't subtle. Although Henry may have had other illegitimate children, Henry Fitzroy was the only one the king acknowledged. That single fact, the only one, tells you how much this boy mattered. For the first 6 years of his life, Henry Fitzroy lived in obscurity. He was kept away from the main court, raised in the country. His upbringing until the moment when he entered Bridewell Palace in June 1525, shrouded in confusion. But in 1525, everything changed. Henry VIII was 44. He'd survived a jousting accident that should have killed him. He'd nearly drowned in a muddy ditch after a botched pole vaulting attempt. Mortality has a way of clarifying your priorities. Catherine was clearly not going to give him a son, and so, on June 18, 1525, Henry VIII brought his 6-year-old boy to Bridewell Palace and transformed him. He was given the title Earl of Nottingham first, and then made the Duke of Richmond and Somerset. During the creation, the young boy came out and knelt before the king. Let that image sink in. A 6-year-old boy in miniature velvet kneeling before the most powerful man in England, who is also his father, then rising and being placed beside him. It should be noted that at this time there were only 2 other dukes in England. By giving Henry Fitzroy a double dukedom and then having Fitzroy on the dais beside him, Henry VIII was elevating his 6-year-old son to the highest peerage in the country and ensuring that everyone was aware of this. That same year, at the age of only 6, he was installed as a Knight of the Garter, the most prestigious order of chivalry in England. He was also made a Knight of the Garter, Lord High Admiral of England, Warden of the Cinque Ports and Constable of Dover Castle. Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord President of the Council of the North, Warden of the Marches and Chamberlain of Chester and North Wales, a 6-year-old Lord High Admiral of England. You can't make this up. Of course, Fitzroy wasn't actually sailing the fleet or presiding over the North. These were symbolic appointments, positions of power and income held in his name, but the message they sent was unmistakable. This boy matters. This boy is being groomed for something. The question was, what? Here's where Fitzroy's story gets genuinely fascinating from a historical standpoint and genuinely heartbreaking from a human one. Henry VIII was obsessed with one thing, a legitimate male heir. This obsession would destroy his marriage to Catherine, put Anne Boleyn on the throne, trigger the English Reformation, and ultimately result in the execution of 2 of his wives. The man burned the entire country down looking for a son, but Henry Fitzroy was already there, already breathing, already his. As Henry and Catherine's marriage remained without a son, the king's only living son became more attractive for onlookers to observe. Some historians believe Henry genuinely considered naming Fitzroy his heir. It seems that Henry VIII regarded him as an appropriate representative in affairs of state, despite his young age, and was even contemplating making Henry Fitzroy his heir after Anne Boleyn failed to bear a living son. There was even a truly bizarre moment, one that tells you how desperate Henry got. When Henry Fitzroy was aged 6, Henry VIII considered marrying the boy off to his half-sister Mary in order to legitimize his claim to the throne. That plan, mercifully, never went anywhere. Instead, in November 1533, when Fitzroy was 14, he was married to Lady Mary Howard. Although due to their young ages, the marriage was never consummated. Mary Howard was also 14. They were children playing at being adults in a court where adults played at being civilized. By this point, Fitzroy was living a life that looked, from the outside, like everything. In 1532, he accompanied the king and Anne Boleyn to Calais for a meeting with King Francis I of France. He was, by all accounts, charming, intelligent, and athletic. Reportedly the spitting image of his father in his younger, more appealing years. He was being shaped for greatness. The only thing standing between Henry Fitzroy and the throne of England was the word bastard. And then 1536 arrived. And 1536 changed everything. 1536 is one of the most violent, chaotic and consequential years in Tudor history. Historians have written entire books about it. And at the centre of that year, like a dark star pulling everything into its orbit, is the fall and execution of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had given Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I, but no living son. Henry was done with her, and the machinery of Tudor destruction, once activated, was merciless. She was beheaded on May 19th. Henry Fitzroy was there. This is worth sitting with, a 17-year-old boy, watching his stepmother, a woman who had reportedly arranged his own marriage, lose her head on a scaffold. Henry VIII had visited his son on the night of Anne's arrest, embracing him and weeping, telling him that he and his half-sister Mary ought to thank God for escaping that cursed woman. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. The speed of it, even by Tudor standards, was breathtaking, and with Jane Seymour came renewed hope of a legitimate heir, which meant Fitzroy's value as a potential successor was quietly diminishing. Fitzroy, of course, didn't know any of this. Well, maybe he did. Maybe that's part of what was eating at him. Henry VIII did not want his son's decline to be witnessed. He did not want it documented, discussed, or mourned in public. By the time Fitzroy was dying, the machinery of erasure was already running. He nearly succeeded. What we have left is fragments, a letter from an ambassador, a chronicler's single sentence, and from those fragments we piece together the last weeks of Henry Fitzroy's life. June 8th, 1536. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, attends the opening of Parliament. He is 17 years old, he is present, he is accounted for. No one who sees him that day writes anything unusual about his appearance, his bearing, his health. He stands in Parliament, and he looks, by all available evidence, fine. That is the last time history sees him on his feet. Between June 8th and July 8th, there are 30 days for which we have almost nothing. No letters from Fitzroy, no court records mentioning his presence, no dispatches, no accounts, no sightings. He simply disappears from the record, whether he fell ill suddenly, a fever that came on fast, the way tuberculosis sometimes does in its final stages, or whether he had been quietly declining for weeks or months, hiding it or unaware of how serious it was. We cannot say with certainty. His biographer Beverly Murphy notes that his public appearances in April and May 1536 gave no suggestion of illness. But tuberculosis is a disease that lies. It hides in the body for months, sometimes years, eroding quietly, and then it doesn't hide anymore. July 8th, 1536. Eustace Chapuz, the imperial ambassador, one of the most meticulous diarists at the Tudor court, writes a letter to Emperor Charles V. In it, almost as an aside, he mentions Henry Fitzroy. His physicians believe him to be consumptive and incurable. 2 words. That's it. That is the entirety of what Chapuz writes about the boy's condition. But those 2 words tell you everything about the state of things. Incurable. By July 8th, the doctors had already given up. Whatever was happening in that room at St. James's Palace, it was beyond their remedies, their bloodlettings, their poultices, their prayers. Picture the room. St. James's Palace in high summer. The windows probably shuttered against the heat and the noise of London outside. The smell of illness, and if you've ever been in a room with someone who is very sick, you know that smell. Tallow candles burning low, physicians coming and going with their grave faces and their useless cures, and somewhere down the corridor, across the city, not coming, his father. Henry Fitzroy lay in that room for 14 days. We have no account of whether he was lucid at the end. We don't know if anyone held his hand. We don't know because nobody wrote it down, or because someone made sure it disappeared. July 22nd, 1536. Henry Fitzroy dies. The chronicler Charles Ruseley records it with the same bluntness that Tudor chroniclers brought to everything. Departed out of this transitory life at the King's Place in St. James, within the King's Park at Westminster, departed out of this transitory life. He was 17 years old. He had been 17 for 37 days. So what killed him? The most widely accepted answer is tuberculosis, consumption, the disease that haunted the Tudor bloodline like a family curse. It killed his half-brother Edward VI at 15. Most historians believe it also killed Henry VIII's older brother Arthur. The same dynasty that burned the country down searching for male heirs kept producing male heirs with compromised lungs. But there are 2 other theories worth knowing about. The first is plague. Philippa Jones has argued that the extraordinary secrecy around Fitzroy's burial, the straw cart, the 2 attendants, the rush out of London, might point to pneumonic plague rather than tuberculosis. The symptoms overlap almost entirely. Fever, chest pain, shortness of breath, rapidly developing pneumonia. And if it was plague, the need to get the body out of London fast makes grim practical sense. You do not leave a plague corpse in the capital. The second theory is poison. It circulated almost immediately at court, the whisper that Fitzroy had been deliberately killed. The finger pointed, predictably, at Anne Boleyn, who had been dead for 2 months by the time Fitzroy drew his last breath. The rumour was almost certainly Catholic propaganda designed to blacken Anne's name further. Most historians dismiss it entirely. What we're left with is this: a 17-year-old boy, alone in a shuttered room in a London summer, dying of something that had probably been building in his body for a long time, dying while his father refused to come, dying while the court moved on to its next crisis, its next marriage, its next execution, dying as quietly and as privately as Henry VIII could arrange. Here is where the story turns genuinely disturbing. Henry Fitzroy died on July 22nd, 1536, at St. James's Palace. He was 17 years old and 17 days past his birthday. And his father did not come. Henry VIII did not attend the deathbed. He did not organise the funeral. He did not announce the death to the kingdom. He handed the body to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Fitzroy's father-in-law, and gave him instructions to bury the boy quietly, far away, out of London, out of sight. What followed was one of the strangest, most undignified royal burials in English history. Henry had ordered the body to be sealed in lead and secretly buried. The coffin was transported in a cart on a bed of straw, accompanied by only 2 mourners on its way to Thetford. The Duke of Richmond and Somerset was secretly carried, 8 days after his death, in a wagon covered with straw, to Thetford Priory in Norfolk. Think about that image. A cart covered in straw, 2 men walking some distance behind it, not allowed to wear their lord's livery. No procession, no mourners lining the road. No ceremony of any kind. Fitzroy was interred in the Howard family vault in Thetford Priory, with only the Duke of Norfolk and his eldest son, the Earl of Surrey, in attendance. Surrey had been one of Fitzroy's closest friends. They had grown up together, studied together, travelled to France together. He was one of the few genuine mourners, and even he, at the funeral of his best friend, could do nothing but stand in a cold priory and watch. There does not appear to have been any arrangements made for alms or prayers to be said for his soul. The king's son was simply laid to rest in the church quietly. Now here is the part that makes Henry VIII look simultaneously monstrous and pathetically human. King Henry wrote to Norfolk several days after Fitzroy's funeral, rebuking him for not giving his dearly departed son a better funeral befitting the young man's high station. He apparently threatened, in one of his rages, to throw Norfolk in the Tower for the insult to his son's memory. The same son he'd refused to publicly mourn, the same son whose death he'd worked to conceal. This is a man unravelling, a man so terrified of death, his own mortality, the fragility of his dynasty, the gaping emptiness in his succession, that he could neither grieve properly nor let anyone else grieve either. Kelly Hart claims that Henry was inconsolable and ordered the quick and private funeral because he wanted his dead son's corpse taken far away from him. Mary Howard, Fitzroy's wife, 16 years old when he died, was left with nothing. Henry VIII, in a final twist of cruelty, refused to release her widow's lands on the grounds that the marriage had not been physically completed. Mary never remarried and was buried alongside him after her death in 1557. When she died, she was placed in the tomb beside the boy she'd barely known in the church at Framlingham, Suffolk, where Fitzroy's remains had been moved after the dissolution of Thetford Priory. There is something quietly devastating about that. Two teenagers married by political arrangement, their union never consummated, the boy dead at 17, and the girl choosing, for the rest of her life, to remain his widow. What if he had lived? This is the question historians can't stop asking, and honestly, neither can I. Henry Fitzroy died on July 22nd, 1536. Edward VI, Henry's legitimate son by Jane Seymour, was born on October 12th, 1537. A gap of just 15 months. If Fitzroy had survived those 15 months, what then? Had Henry Fitzroy survived, he might well have inherited the throne ahead of his half-sisters. Both Mary and Elizabeth were still officially bastards. Instead of our first two reigning queens, we might have had Henry IX. But even if Fitzroy had survived long enough for Edward to be born, what would his position have been? Henry had never formally named him heir. He never quite committed. That was Henry's way. Keep everyone useful, keep everyone uncertain, keep everyone close enough to be used and far enough to be discarded. Fitzroy spent his entire life in that space, close enough to be the king's son, not close enough to be the king's heir. There's one more thread worth pulling. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, Fitzroy's best friend, was executed in January 1547. One of the last people Henry VIII killed before his own death. Henry Fitzroy's mother, Bessie Blount, died around 1539 or 1540, still young, largely forgotten. Fitzroy himself was 17 and already a historical footnote before his body was cold. His widow never remarried. His best friend lost his head. Let me bring you back to that image. A wooden coffin, hidden under straw, a cart moving through the English countryside. Two men in green walking at a distance, not allowed to wear their lord's colours. That is how England buried the son of its king. In silence, in secret, as if the whole embarrassing business of Henry Fitzroy's existence could simply be carted away and forgotten. It couldn't. Henry Fitzroy had been the most visible possible proof that Henry VIII could father healthy sons. His very existence was, for over a decade, the thing that kept Henry's pride intact while Catherine of Aragon failed pregnancy after pregnancy. See, it's not me, it's her. Here is my boy, here is my proof. And then the proof died, at 17, on a July morning in a palace that smelled of summer heat and sickness. We don't get to keep Henry IX. We got a cart covered in straw. We got a tomb in Framlingham that most tourists drive past without stopping. And we got this story which is what history is made of. Not the kings on their thrones, but the boys who almost were, and the grief that got buried with them. That's Henry Fitzroy, the boy his father couldn't face in death. If you want more stories like this, the forgotten people, the almost kings, the women and children history shoved to the edges, subscribe, leave a comment, tell me who you want me to dig up next. I'm building a whole archive of the rotten ages here, and we are just getting started. I'll see you in the next one.